Welcome to the Daily Bread Bible Study. This is day 177 for Thursday, June 25th, 2020. We're focusing on just one psalm for today, the longest psalm, Psalm 119. Now, not only is it the longest psalm, it's also the longest chapter in the Bible. It's this long because of its form. It has 8 lines for each letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And so there are 22 letters there in the Hebrew alphabet, 8 lines for each. That gives us a total of 176 lines that we will be looking at here in this psalm. So this psalm, is kind of an encapsulation of all the thoughts of the psalms, around it. It goes over, many different points that the rest of the psalms take on. And so let's just, set it up with what the focus is, the ways of the Lord. So in Psalm 119, verse 1, happy are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. The law of God is very important, especially for these people who were exiled there by Babylon and trying to hold on to their identity. They remember the past, the way that they were brought out of slavery in Egypt by Moses during the Exodus, and that they received from Mount Sinai the gift of the law of the Lord. And so the ways of the Lord are important to remember and to follow, and it gives them identity as a community. So that's why this focus of the Psalm 119 will be on the ways of the Lord. And so I'm just going to pick out a couple verses that I think are significant around, within that section of each of the letters. So within those 8 verses for each one of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So first, the ways of the Lord are valuable. We see that in verse 14, which says, I delight in the way of your decrees as much as in all riches. So that theme of gold, wealth, comes up here in Psalm 119. In verse 19 of Psalm 119, it's another reference to the Babylonian exile. It says, I live as an alien in the land. Do not hide your commandments from me. So just a reminder that the Babylonian exile happened around 587 BC. And we see that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes in and sacks, utterly destroying Jerusalem and even, making the temple be destroyed and desecrated. And so from that, the people were pulled out of Jerusalem and Judea, and they were taken to Babylonia. We see, moving on to verse 31, it says, I cling to your decrees, O Lord, let me not be put to shame. So holding on to God's decrees for identity, formation, and connection with God. Verse 36 and 37 says, the ways of the Lord are about communal justice, not just trivial, selfish things. Because it says in verse 36, turn my heart to your decrees and not to selfish gain. Turn my eyes from looking at vanities. Give me life in your ways. In verse 46, it says, I will also speak of your decrees before kings and shall not be put to shame. This reminds me a lot of the way Moses in the Exodus spoke against the king of Egypt called Pharaoh. And this also foreshadows a little bit of Jesus, the coming Messiah for us Christians, and the way in which he will speak against the authorities of his day and time and not be put to shame. In verse 54, a heartwarming blessing, for those who are distant in distant places or in situations, I can sympathize with this journey of the pastor, going away from your hometown, right? It's a journey away from the familiar, and it can be difficult. So in verse 54, it says, your statutes have been my songs wherever I make my home. It's been true for me, and may it be true for you as well. Psalm 57 just reminds us again, the Lord is my portion. I promise to keep your words. Moving on to verse 71. This is kind of a counterintuitive thought, which is very common for a lot of the wisdom of God. Which basically says the less ego that we have, the more God is able to thrive. So verse 71 says, "It is good for me that I was humbled, so that I might learn your statutes." On to verse 77, which says, "Let your mercy come to me, that I may live, for your law is my delight." See, God appreciates renewal. God is quick to forgive us when we turn astray, and when we turn back to God, God is there with open arms. So this verse kind of encapsulates God's mercy. In Psalm 84, talks a little bit, or verse 84, talks about the human nature to ask questions in challenging circumstances. Very strong biblical theme. The book of Job is all about a lot of questions for God. Verse 84 is kind of, captures this thought, saying, "How long must your servant endure? When will you judge those who persecute me?" So we see a lot of critiques from others, makes it really hard. And we are, as humans, in our nature, we call out to God and ask why. Verse 92 says, "If your law had not been my delight, I would have perished in my misery." This is both a helpful one, seeing that the law of the Lord is kind of a hope for the writer of this psalm. But, for my tradition, especially the Lutheran tradition, right, the law is not seen as much as hopeful. We tend to devalue the law, but the law does have an important function. One of the uses of the law is that it reveals our need for another Savior, our inability, our need for God and specifically Christ to redeem us. So the law has its places and its purpose. In verse 100 of this psalm, accepting the wisdom of this faith tradition, God makes us wise, and we can learn from others' encounters of God. As it says in verse 100, "I understand more than the aged, for I keep your precepts." When we have the wisdom that's come from thousands of years of people, in choosing to capture this ideas and to maintain them and uphold them and uplift them, right? We stand in a tradition much longer than ourselves in our own lifespan, and thus we are able to, in some sense, contain the wisdom of 2,000 years within our own lives. A very humbling image, and one that should give you confidence regardless of your age. In verse 105, it's a very famous line that says, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." So just imagine walking in darkness with a flashlight. It helps. Verse 114 says, "You are my hiding place and my shield, and I hope in your word." So this theme is repeated, especially among King David's psalms, saying that God is a fortress, a stronghold, a rock, a shelter. All of this idea encapsulated in this verse. Verse 121 connects to hoping for a sense of justice, common reference in the theme, or common theme in the Psalms, I should say. Verse 121 says, "I have done what is just and right. Do not leave me to my oppressors." Moving on to verse 130, God's law gives us new eyes to see the obvious realities. And as the imagery of light comes back, saying, "The unfolding of your words gives light. It imparts understanding to the simple." So we get to see that God's words, once they illuminate our lives, they can make it pretty visible of where God's at and what God's up to and how God is calling us to move forward. In verse 139 of Psalm 119, it says, "My zeal consumes me because my foes forget your words." This is the idea of righteous anger, the idea of being very fervent and following God's laws and God's ways, and looking upon other individuals and saying, how frustrating it is to look when people do not obey the same, values that you have. This is exactly what Jesus, has his righteous anger there as he cleanses the temple, as he overthrows the money changers, and the ways in which he was seeing it become just a market, a economic, transaction of money, instead of, being able to equip people for worshiping God. As we get towards the end, we have verses 150 and 151, which talk about the reality of our lives. There is opposition. Those who persecute me with evil purpose draw near. They are far from your law. Yet you are near, O Lord, and all your commandments are true. Verse 160 says talks about God's wisdom remaining applicable in our day and lives too, saying in verse 160, the sum of your word is truth, and every one of your righteous ordinances endures forever. It's very timeless, lasted, these 2,000 years, and we'll get to see, just a lot of wisdom, 2,000 plus years. The Psalms are much older than, Jesus as well. Let's go on to verse 165, our second to last one, which says, clarity of mind with God brings order to our daily chaos. The actual verse says, great peace have those who love your law. Nothing can make them stumble. So may God come and order your chaos whenever you feel particularly chaotic. And so in our last verse that we'll choose is Psalm 100 and verse 175, talking about what constitutes a life worth living. For the psalmist, it is living God's ways each day in order to have purpose and peaceful life. So in closing, we have 175. Let me live that I may praise you, and let your ordinances help me. That's my sentiment for you. May this overview of all the Psalms in one psalm, these ideas and themes that have been true and are still true in our day and time, may they inspire you as you focus on loving God's law, God's ways, God's wisdom, and helping it be applicable to bring you peace in your day and time. So, thanks for joining me. I look forward to another Daily Bread Bible study coming up tomorrow.